This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Angus Deaton. He is a British-American economist. In 2015, he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. And those topics go directly into one of the most hotly politicized debates, discussions that we can possibly have as a humanity, which is inequality. Angus brings some great insights to the subject of inequality. As a side note, I think I was slightly motivated after meeting with Barry Ritholtz in December. As we were talking about our podcast, we were talking about Nobel Prize winners that we had each had on our podcast. And I think we were tied. I think Barry had 4 and I had 4. But Barry also remarked that he's had far fewer episodes than I have had. Well, which is a true point. So in the spirit of trying to stay competitive on my podcast and making sure that I bring on the brightest minds alive today and continuing to find those Nobel Prize winners, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Angus Deaton.
Where are you?
I'm in Saigon this morning.
Oh, you're in Saigon. My goodness. Is that where you hang out, or you?
You know, I came to Asia a few years ago for a speaking tour, and I kind of fell in love with the area, and I've spent a lot of time in Saigon. So yeah, it's been nice.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll send you some Skype pictures after the sunrise this morning. It was absolutely beautiful. I was out taking pictures before I was getting on the phone with you.
Wow, it sounds terrific.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm sort of more or less ready. I have myself a glass of sherry, which I love one, but I don't know how to make that happen through Skype.
I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in.
Sure.
I was trying to think what it would feel like to be awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. And I'm sure from your perspective, there's a great satisfaction to a life's work. I was thinking about myself. Well, actually, if I was in that position, what's got to be so satisfying is that not only do you have a chance to shape the debate and shape the discussion on some very important topics today while we're both alive, but even in the future when we're both gone. That's kind of got to be an interesting feeling, isn't it?
Do you think the Nobel does that? I mean, it certainly opens up the current debate in ways that were not open before. I mean, that's certainly clear. Sort of people listen to you. I have this sort of view, or maybe it's just a hope, and it may not be true, that, posterity takes a better view of such things and decides based on the content rather than on the... It's rather hard to tell, right? Because the Nobel Prize hasn't been running all that long. And there are people who got the Nobel Prize in economics that are not much read anymore. On the other hand, there are certainly people on the other side, like Hayek, who'd been almost forgotten when he got the Nobel Prize, and who had brought him back to prominence, which he's never really lost, even long after his death.
Well, this would be your nature to some degree, right? You're going to be skeptical of the data, and you're going to want to dig in and find out, is this actually true, right?
Yeah, well, I certainly think I haven't really thought about it, but the Hayek example certainly gives one a potential idea, which is that, this certainly means that a lot of people are going to read what I write more than otherwise, and that does give you a chance that stuff will strike a chord which will, go on for a while. So, yeah, maybe that's right.
I want to cover, in our limited amount of time today, I want to cover some important topics to your life's work. Where I want to start today is with this buzz. It's a buzzword in all the rage in America, which is inequality. And you have looked at inequality in depth in ways that most of us could not imagine, just the amount of work that you've put in at it. And I want to break this apart in many different levels. But one of the things I wanted to talk about first is, inequality, and I've seen this is in your world, is a marker of success. If you create something, you get rewarded, there's going to be inequality. And some of the greatest inequalities, they've come from our greatest successes. I wonder if you might just talk about that for a moment. That might strike people as funny, that inequality comes from success.
Yeah, well, that's one of the running themes of my book, The Great Escape. I think it's actually very, very important. I think it's something that's an idea that I keep pushing because I think it's not a particularly partisan idea. I think that it plays into, I guess the right is somewhat more sympathetic to that idea, but I don't think the left could have reasonable objection to it just on the grounds that you just put. I mean, it's very hard when people say inequality is very, very harmful. Then you say, well, as one of my colleagues put it, what has Mark Zuckerman done to harm the poor? What has Bill Gates done to harm the poor? And inequality gets larger when people at the very top do very well. It's, as you said, in periods where there's been a tremendous amount of innovation, there's been typically a very large increase in inequality. And that by itself, I think, is welcome. You have to worry about what happens next, but the giving people who do enormous amount of good and come up with wonderful innovations big rewards for that, in general, seems to be a good thing. But then, of course, there are lots and lots of qualifications.
Some of the problems that might exist with inequality, the misallocation of resources. So, for example, there could be the taxpayer bailouts for bankers on Wall Street. There could be political favoritism. Speak to that to some degree.
Yeah, well, even before that is some of the things that people have been very successful in inventing and very heavily rewarded for things may not actually be in the public interest at all. So one of the issues there, which gets close to what you were talking about, is this idea that, if social incentives and private incentives are not properly aligned, then people get paid enormous sums of money for doing things that actually may have very little social value or may actually make the world a worse place. So many people think what happened to Wall Street in 2008 was an example of people who were getting paid large sums of money to sort of harm the world. And I think even for people who are more skeptical about that, the idea that these incredibly smart kids out of Harvard or Princeton or Tel Aviv or whatever are off there, inventing instruments of mass destruction rather than curing cancer or making the next iPhone, I think does give one pause. So there can be very bad incentives there if the misallocation there of talent, if the private and social incentives are not aligned. And then there's the issue that you raised, which is, if the rich manage to get a hold of the political process, then that can lead to very bad things too. So that if people get very rich, even if it doesn't reduce my income, if they then use their wealth to successfully lobby for things that harm me, like restricting my political access or setting the rules for something I really care about, then that really is a serious matter. And then that wealth is really harming me, even if it doesn't harm me directly. So those are the things that we really, really worry about. Of course, it's not entirely clear that the rich have successfully bought the political process, as we see in the current American election, for example.
Yes, it's definitely a groundswell, right?
Yeah, well, it's complicated, right? I mean, there's a lot of people with a lot of money, and it's sort of ironic that someone like Trump, who has enormous sums of money, may actually rescue us from the people who have even more money and have spent years plotting to overturn the political equilibrium.
Yeah. Let me let you dig into some really foundational aspects of your career. That's the collecting of data. We're all so used to turning on the nightly news and we hear an aggregate data measure about the economy. But you're a man who spent your career looking at the very micro level of data, the household data, consumption data. Talk about that early on start for you and your fascination with getting, frankly, I would call it down to the nitty gritty level of really looking at individual consumer data, the best that you can find it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I started out almost on the other end. I mean, when I was very young, first starting out, I was looking at the aggregate economy, and I was looking at, what predicted consumer demand or what controlled saving, and all the models then, and even for a long, long time afterwards, and it's not done yet, were models in which people looked at the average or the aggregate. They looked at the whole economy. And then they would apply models of what was called the representative agent, meaning there was one person who was supposed to be like the whole economy. And that always bothered me from very, very early on. And I always wanted to think about this in terms of individuals. And then the individuals sort of led us back to the household surveys where you got individual records of individual behavior. And then for much of my career, I've been trying to, integrate those two things to say, well, how should you think about the individuals? What happens when we look at the individual data? Those individual data tell us something about the aggregate. Can we root macroeconomics, the study of aggregate fluctuations in those household survey data? And a lot of the time you can't because the data are so bad. And the data are weak, both in the surveys and in the aggregates. So that's, another great unhappiness in the sense that you don't want to look at those things too hard because you get very depressed about it. The famous economist V. Grillikich used to say about data, he said, data are like meatballs. He said, I won't eat them out when I'm eating out because I don't know what's in them, and I won't eat them at home because I do know what's in them. And, there's that sort of curse. If you spend your time looking at data, you can become very despondent.
I was thinking about in my world, I sometimes look at performance data of traders and I think about, okay, you can look at a monthly performance data point, but if you don't really know what went into it, it only tells you so much. And it struck me that, that's been a large part of your career is like, say, okay, let's just tear this apart to the best that we can and get inside. Give the audience, as a man that's just been awarded this Nobel Memorial Prize, give the audience some great insight about one of the things that you've learned about poverty in data as you get down into the data.
Well, I think the most important thing of that is just, if you take a country where I've worked quite a lot, India, and India is very important for thinking about global poverty. Because I don't know what the number is, but it's something like about a third of all the World Bank's poverty counts come from people living in India. Be a third, but maybe a quarter, but it's that sort of number. So if you want to look in one single place as to where all the poor are, India is a really good place to look. And yet it's a very weird thing because India has actually been getting rich pretty rapidly. Because of this very rapid growth over the last 30 or 40 years, unprecedented growth by historical standards. And yet you just don't see as much poverty reduction as you would expect to see given that very rapid rate of growth. And, a lot of people in India and outside of India say, India can't be all that poor. It's full of all these great scientists and it's been growing like crazy. How can you say it's a poor country? And yet you look at the data, there it is. And you can say, well, how do those two things coexist? And why is this growth not generating, all the poverty reduction that we really expect of it? And that's, a hugely important question because is it not generating poverty reduction because all the growth is going to the top 1%? Or is it not generating poverty reduction because of some other fault in the system? Well, what it turns out is the data sets are just inconsistent with one another. We can't even begin to answer that question. And, it's a source of despair to me that there's all this hot air and rhetoric going on about international growth, poverty, and inequality. And the international organizations or the NGOs or other people are just not prepared to put the money in to try and get these data straight so that we actually know what's going on. And I think that's a huge problem in the world.
And that's just at the measuring level, because I've seen you make comments about direct aid that many times you don't have a positive view about foreign aid to many poor countries, do you?
Not when it's spent in large amounts in the country. I'm actually quite in favor of foreign aid if it's spent on things that would benefit those countries from the outside. So, for instance, just to take a past example, the West discovered what was causing HIV/AIDS, for example. That discovery, which was not foreign aid, but it was of enormous aid to foreign countries in Africa who could then begin to do things that would help bring that epidemic under control. So that paying for the development of knowledge, for example, is something that I'm very much in favor of. I'm not uniquely in favor of that. There are many, many people who do that, including like the Gates Foundation and so on, who's spending a lot of money on stimulating research on, vaccines for diseases where we don't have vaccines and so on. I mean, that seems to be very important. And that doesn't have the drawbacks that I see of countries where an enormous fraction of government revenue is coming from abroad. I think that's very problematic.
Talk about the poverty trap for a moment and connect the dots for the audience that might not be familiar with your work. The ideas of low incomes, low caloric intake, malnutrition, how some of these issues tie together in, frankly, unexpected ways.
In very unexpected ways. I am not a great fan of the concept that's called the poverty trap, which is some idea somehow that people are trapped in there, and by their own efforts they can't really get out. But let me address the sort of more second part of that, which is, the ways that calories relate to poverty is very surprising. And I think, some of the work I've been most excited about that I've done in the last decade or so is with my friend and collaborator Jean Drèze in India, where you get this very surprising thing in India. I mean, that you have this very rapid economic growth, and it may not be quite as rapid as we think it is, but no one doubts there's been real progress in India, at least at the average. You've got the worst malnutrition, or there may be a couple of other places that are as bad, among the worst malnutrition in the world, so that something like 50% of all Indian children are way off their growth charts. I mean, the sort of thing, if you took a kid along to a pediatrician, they would say, look, we've really got to do something. This kid's in real serious danger. So over a half, or about a half. And Indian men and women are among the shortest people on the planet because they didn't get enough to eat. One of my ex-students, Diane Coffey, has just looked at what happens to Indian women in pregnancy, and they don't get enough to eat. So you've got this enormous amount of malnutrition going on. You've got all this economic growth. And if you look across rich people and poor people, the rich people eat more calories, more protein. And yet, during all this period in India, the average per capita intake of calories is actually falling. So you've got the opportunity to get out of here, and it seems like people are not taking it because the per capita calorie consumption is falling. So this is just a huge puzzle, which, we have some ideas about what's causing it, but it's just, as you said, a really, really surprising thing. What the hell is going on here? Here seems like the first thing you would expect when a really poor country begins to grow rapidly was for food consumption to go up. The calories to go up, protein to go up, and it's not. We don't really know. And sorting that out is a challenge for economics and a challenge for food policy and, a lot of other things. That's just one of these things that's sort of a puzzle. It's a paradox. It's not the way we think the world ought to be.
Puzzles are something that have definitely motivated you. I have a feeling that is, as much as you take satisfaction in the work and where you go, I think the solving the puzzle is a driver for you, isn't it?
It is, but you have to manufacture the puzzles too.
Well, yeah, they just don't appear. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Hey, let me address also one thing on the poverty issue that I thought was really interesting in your work. So we often hear about the poverty line, and this made me actually. I hope you don't take this as a negative thing, but it made me think of you almost as a Seinfeld type observation, because we can all imagine here's this poverty line, this arbitrary line set, and if you're below the line, perhaps the system, the political systems might give you a benefit or some assistance. But if you're right above the line, then you're ruled out. And the line's just an arbitrary measure, isn't it?
I've always argued that, and I gave up arguing it because no one paid any attention to me. I use this quote from David Copperfield, where Mr. McColliver says, if you're, I won't get this right off the cuff, but it's like if your weekly income is £1 and your weekly expenditure is £1 and a halfpenny, the result is misery. If your weekly income is a shilling and is £1 and your weekly expenditure is 19 shillings and 19 pence or 11 pence or whatever it is, the result is happiness. So it's this sort of knife-edge property that if you just have enough, you're okay. And it's crazy because, the idea that governments would, treat people differently who are just the smallest distance apart you can imagine is nonsense. And especially when you have no idea where to put that line anyway. I don't know. I rant against this, but I think the idea seems to be that people can understand about cutoffs like that. To some extent, the main point of these poverty lines is for propaganda. I mean, it's for NGOs and the UN and the Pope and so on to say that there are millions and millions of people out there who are living on an unimaginably small number. Maybe that's effective, but it's certainly been very hard to get beyond that.
How do you think poverty should be measured?
Well, I'm not sure you should be measuring poverty at all, because the poverty is this idea of a cutoff. There are people who are poor and there are people who are not poor. So I'm pretty happy just to treat one pretty good way of doing it was everybody's poor, but some people are much poorer than others. So that would be one way of looking at it. I mean, you don't want to give the rich a huge break, huge attention in public policy, but the poorer people are, the more you might want to give them. So that would be, or the more attention they might deserve. And so that would be one way of thinking about it. I do think, though, the data in much of the world is so weak that regretfully we should pay less. Well, not regretfully. There are many other aspects of poverty, including health, education, and so on. And I think we should pay much more attention to those, if only because I think they're a lot better measured. We have much more idea of how many kids are malnourished than we probably do how many kids are living in households who are, making less than $2 a day.
Yeah, you raised the pitfalls here of measuring poverty or trying to measure poverty across time and place. It can be a very difficult, if not impossible thing to do.
That's exactly right. And, these surveys are not consistent. I was looking the other day, household surveys, when you ask people how much they spend, in countries where there's really good healthcare provision by the state and people are not charged anything for that, you'll see very little health expenditure in those surveys. But people are getting a lot of health and you're just not picking it up at all. On the other hand, if the government is terrible and people pay for healthcare in the market, then people look like they're doing much better because they're spending a lot more on health. But, so then your poverty measure is completely hostage to how you organize your healthcare sector. And if you look across African countries, there are countries where almost 80% of healthcare is spent out of pocket, and others where it's sort of like 25%. There's huge inconsistencies in that, and you can say much the same for education. A lot of people pay for their kids' education. But, in many cases, that's because they're actually poorer than people who are getting it for free. Just like in the U.S., people are delighted to be able to send their kids for free to a really good public school system. But then that wouldn't show up in their expenditure, and they would look like they were poorer than someone who's having to send their kids to a really bad private school because the public schools were terrible. So, we're just not getting that stuff right.
As we're talking about lines, I would love for you to address a little bit another issue that's popular for debate in America and even outside of America. I hear many non-Americans talking about the issue, which is the notion of minimum wage. Hotly debated. People can have all types of different views. And I want to connect that dot to something like Walmart. And here's Walmart that provides so many thousands of jobs for people. Walmart also provides people goods and services that they probably 20, 30, 40 years ago could not have received all in one location, and perhaps could not have even found those things that you could buy in a Walmart in their town or location. And then you have this one family that has had all this success at providing so many Americans all these goods and services. And this one family has become this great marker of inequality. And I don't know what the exact number is, but the Walmart heirs have something to the effect of like 30 or 40% of the entire American population, their wealth combined. It's a really interesting conundrum, isn't it?
I wish you were here and entering that debate, because you're talking about it in exactly the right sort of way. I mean, the other thing about Walmart that you must remember is China. A lot of those cheap goods, I mean, the Walton family has obviously been a big part of this, but, a lot of the benefits of cheap goods are to do with manufacturing in China. These things are complicated and there are trade-offs. on both sides of this. And reasonable people can, I think, come to very different judgments about something like the minimum wage and how high you want to have it. I think it would be better off, we'd be better off if it were higher, but there's also got to be a limit. But just to come back to the inequality issue, one of the things that I'm very happy about, and I've sort of said this in the context of the prize, is that there is a real debate going on in America now about inequality. So it used to be that on the right, it was just dismissed as not an issue at all. There's a famous quote of Marty Feldstein, who says inequality is not an issue that needs to be addressed. Dismiss inequality and say it was a problem that required to be addressed, and dismiss people who talked about inequality as, starting class warfare or something. And on the left, people didn't talk about it very seriously either. They just said inequality is a really bad thing without explaining why. I think, because of the rapid rise in inequality in the United States and the huge amounts of money that are going to the very top, and a lot of that has been, the data work of Sias and Piketty and others who sort of brought this to public attention. There's a real serious debate going about it, and that's what we have to have. I mean, who knows where that debate is going to come down? I think we've at least got to the point where we think it's not a good idea for everybody to have the same, because then there'd be no incentives in the world at all. It's not a good idea for one guy to own everything, because that would be a disaster. So there's some sort of optimal degree of inequality in between those two things. And I guess the task for a democracy is to figure out where that is and to persuade enough people to shift the political equilibrium and to find out where that is. Now, I don't quite know where that is, but, it's an issue that we should be talking about, and we are talking about it. But it's relatively recent.
Talk about money and happiness. We all wake up as young people and we say, well, we want to make this fortune. And, that's the early 20s, like, hey, I want this fortune. And some people make an incredible fortune, as we're talking about. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't work out that there's a happiness increase necessarily at a certain point. However, and you've pointed this out, not having a certain amount of money is a really negative thing.
No, I think that's right. Danny Kahneman and I wrote this paper about that. But I mean, that paper, I think, was not perfectly understood. I mean, there's always a problem when you always want your papers to attract a lot of attention in the press. And then when you get it, you wish you hadn't, sort of idea, because you never get exactly what you want. One of the main points of that paper was that you have to separate out two sorts of happiness, and we use happiness in two very different senses. One of those senses is whether what your mood is like, what your emotional affect, what you're feeling like now, being happy, and things like, momentary joy, having a good time at some point during the day that you look back on with enormous pleasure. That's sort of the emotional version of happiness. But there's also this sense of asking people how their lives are going. And that's a different concept altogether. And it's also entitled to the word happiness, but it's an overall judgment of life. The ancient Greeks thought you couldn't find out whether someone was happy until after they were dead. Because it was only after they're dead that you could look back on their whole life and decide. So happiness is the sort of score that St. Peter gives you at the pearly gates, this sort of idea. You could easily feel very happy in one sense and not be happy at all in the other sense. And an example I like to use is, an elderly relative that you much admire and love spending time with has died at the age of 95 after living a really good life. You could be very sad, but you could also feel that this was a natural part of life and that your life was going very well. So that's an example of where the two things go differently. So what Danny and I found was that not having enough was very corrosive of your day-to-day emotional experience. And that, beyond a certain point, it didn't seem to matter very much for that people could find happiness in their daily life, provided they weren't being nagged at by poverty all the time. On the other hand, if you ask people how their lives were going, that just seemed to keep on going up the more money they had. And of course, that's not an easy thing to assess, because it's hard to study people who are really, really rich. that was what we find. And so your summary, I think, is right. That, a lot of the day-to-day emotional happiness comes from spending time with other people, hanging out with friends, doing activities in common. And, if you're so short of money that you can't go out with friends and you say, no, I really can't do that. I can't go out for a drink. I can't go out for a meal. We can't go to the ball game together. I think that really interferes with people's opportunities for happiness.
I told you I was going to jump around on you a little bit. You've got a really interesting career. You've covered a lot of big areas. I would be amiss, though, if I did not ask a few things about your career that I think really, if you put your professorial hat on, which you always have on, the almost ideal demand system. Why don't you give people a quick overview? Because that is one of the things that the Nobel Committee was looking at, your career and your work. And that was one of the big achievements. Why don't you try and explain that to the audience? Some people that are probably not familiar with your work, and just give a broad overview of some of the insight that came from that.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard because it was essentially a solution to a technical problem. And the fame of it, I think, has been, like a lot of these things, it solved more problems than we were actually looking at. And so it's been very, very widely used. But a part of it was that we were just trying to find, it's about predicting or understanding how, a really fundamental economic problem that had been around for hundreds of years, which is how people respond to prices in particulars. And, much of government policy is to do with changing prices. Taxes and tariffs and all the rest of it. Cigarette prices, gas prices, all that sort of stuff. And so understanding, how people adapt their behavior when prices change has always been a central question in economics. I think I was lucky enough with my friend John Milbar to be in on the bottom story of a number of technical innovations in how to look at that and how to make it easier to connect up the way people responded to prices with how you could read off their well-being or their welfare. So you could figure out how it would be that if, say, a monopolist were keeping prices high or a cable company were extorting high prices, what would it be worth to people to make that go away? A lot of the almost ideal demand system was what I think of as tinkering. A number of people had done a number of similar things, and we just tinkered with it. And I remember actually spending months and months and months trying to tinker with little moving parts here to get something that was really convenient and that would be widely used. And we certainly succeeded in that. So this is very heavily used, and it's really like a nicer car sort of idea. We didn't invent a motor car, but we put nice moving parts on it, so it was very convenient to drive and very convenient to use. We also got away from something I mentioned very early on, which is there was a representative agent was the way people looked at these things. There was only one person in the economy. And for us, that was a real problem. Why, if you change the distribution of income, why didn't the way people spend their money change? And we incorporated that into the almost ideal demand system based on some work that John Milbar had really done before that. It really was, I think, a very nice piece of tinkering is the way I would think about it. A very successful piece of tinkering. And that's why it gets so very heavily cited and people use it for lots of things. It's a slick piece of engineering, if you like.
Tinkering should not be discounted.
No,
not. I'm sure you can imagine right off the top of your head as you say that many other colleagues of yours, and you just look at their careers probably with admiration, and you say, I just admire their tinkering. They just kept at it.
Yep. Well, some economic historians have characterized the Industrial Revolution as, decades of tinkering, endless tinkering. And that's what the Industrial Revolution was. That's how people make better cars. They tinker with old cars until they get really better ones. So I think tinkering is way up there in my pantheon.
I want to talk about the birth lottery. So we talk about inequality, we talk about poverty, but there is something to the birth lottery. I'm lucky
that everybody gets a grant at birth.
Well, I'm lucky enough to be born outside Washington, D.C. in the Northern Virginia suburbs. My father was a dentist. That's pretty lucky. But for, let's say, Yeah, for some kids, and I mean, even kids today, the real issue is, frankly, where they're born. Because if you talked about India, if we go India, Africa, it's not that the kids are necessarily dying from, these wild new diseases. It's just the basics that they can't get by on.
Yep. No, that's right. And I mean, I think, as far as income and health are concerned, some enormous variation of what happens in the world is just determined by what you call the birth lottery, that you were born in the wrong place. There's some argument that that's getting better in some ways, and some argument that it's getting worse in other ways. I think the birth lottery is probably less severe on India versus Europe than it was 100 years ago, for example. I mean, I think things have gotten better in Europe, in India, relative to Europe. But there's a lot of argument that it's getting worse within the U.S. So, if you're born on the wrong side of the tracks now, it's much harder to cross the tracks today than it was 40 or 50 years ago. There's a terrific new book by Bob Putnam called Our Kids, which is arguing that. And it's arguing that what several people have argued, that, higher inequality comes with worse inequality of opportunity. So that as inequality increases in the United States, the rich make sure they grab all the resources for their kids. It's much harder for smart kids who are born on the wrong side of the tracks to get into that than once was the case. And I think that's a very serious matter if it's true. And I think Bob's very persuasive that that is the problem.
As we wind down, I want to ask you, books you're reading today. You just mentioned one. Are there any other titles that you might recommend to people today that are keeping you fascinated?
Well, in that same vein, I just finished Kathy Eaton's new book, which has, I think, really changed my mind about a lot of things, which is called, I forget the title, but it's something like Living in America on $2 a day. She and her co-author, whose name I've forgotten, claim that there's a substantial number of people in the U.S. living on less than $2 a day. And this is the World Bank Global Poverty Line that was only supposed to apply in Africa and South Asia. And then it turns out that there's a lot of people in the U.S. living below that. I'm really rethinking my own position on this because, we used to think, okay, there's poverty in the U.S., but those people are not really poor, compared with if you go to Africa and India, I'll show you poverty. But that really may not be true. It certainly tempers your view of globalization. If it's not just, if it's actually hollowing out American society too, and that goes along with Putnam stuff, I think. I also read a fair amount of history. I'm reading Robert Toombs's wonderful book on the English and their history, I think it's called. And it's a sort of, 800-page history of Britain from, the Stone Age to now. And it's really wonderfully erudite and light touch and covers all the ground with a consistent vision, which I think is just terrific. I'm really, really enjoying that. I just picked up Harry Frankfurter's book on inequality, which I'm looking forward to reading. He wrote a famous book called On Bullshit, and I'm looking forward to the same philosophical intelligence brought to dealing with the issue of inequality. I read a lot of novels too, so I get a lot of stuff on the go. One of the things about a Kindle is you can have about 12 books open at once, and you seem to flip more successfully between them than used to be the case when they were real physical books.
Let me ask you my last question. You're just getting started. You're 69, 70 now? 70?
70, yeah.
So you're just getting started. So what will happen? What will happen in the next 30 years? I mean, you can't retire. Who wants to retire? No one wants to retire. Really? Do they? Do you?
I signed the papers with Princeton that, like most Ivy League schools, is on a campaign to get its older staff off the premises. And so I signed on to the retirement package 4 days before the prize was announced.
But I don't mean that technical stuff. I mean the spirit, the interior.
No, I can't imagine anything any different than I was doing before. I just won't have to teach. And I would say that I don't have to administer either. But then my wife, who's probably not so far away, is probably giggling in the background saying I don't do any of that anyway. But I won't have to teach, and I won't have to prepare new courses, and I won't have to be involved in faculty politics and things like that. I'm very much looking forward to having all that time to myself and to continuing to write and research. I think one of the things that I probably will do as I get older is write more broadly and spend less time doing the hard technical grind with large data sets. But that may not even be true. I mean, my wife is also a professor here in Case, and we did this work this summer on whites dying in middle age, which got like about 10 times as much attention as the Nobel Prize did. I didn't think that was possible. And that's very data intensive work, and we're certainly doing a lot more on that.
I wish you the best. I really fascinated to dig into your career because you are touching on topics and subjects from inequality to poverty, which are so hotly politically debated. And I can't seem to find anybody that is classifying you as a partisan to one side or another. You must feel quite proud of that.
I think it's a little bit delicate, but yes. I am quite proud of it. And also, I think I want to try to maintain that because I do think actually talking across this polarized divide is an incredibly important thing to try to do because it's not, there are issues that should appeal to both sides.
Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to get ahead. The question is how do we get most people there, if we could get everyone there, but how do we get everyone moving in that path, in that direction? And we're not all on parallel tracks, and it's a tricky, thorny issue with lots of side directions and tangential issues, and it's complicated.
It really is. Yeah.
Professor, thank you for taking some time today. I most appreciate it.
Thanks very much. It's been fun talking to you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.